If you've just started playing Going Medieval now in 1.0, or even if you had been following the game before its final release, one thing becomes very clear after a few hours. The game explains the basics, but several of the best strategies remain somewhat hidden, and that is exactly where many promising colonies start to go wrong without you even realizing why. So in this video, I have put together 10 hidden mechanics that truly make a difference in your progression, from construction and storage details to survival tricks that can make your village much more efficient. I'm Mary, and the video is about to begin.
Going Medieval 1.0 brought a silent but brutal change to the temperature system. Ice no longer freezes below 0 degrees Celsius the same way it used to. This means that the strategy of throwing ice on the pantry floor and praying is no longer as efficient. But don't worry, because the game gives you a solution that is almost a cheat, except it is completely legitimate. Underground areas at levels -1 or -2, when surrounded by raw dirt without wood or stone flooring, keep the temperature naturally low all year round, usually between 3 and 6 degrees Celsius. This happens because dirt acts as an incredible natural insulator, and the more layers of soil around it, the more stable that environment becomes. It's basically medieval physics applied to the game, and most people don't realize it because the game doesn't explain it anywhere. You'll discover it by accident, or someone will tell you, like I'm doing right now. The really smart part is knowing how to seal this space correctly. Clay or limestone walls have an insulation of approximately 0.9, which is excellent for holding that natural cold inside. But the real secret is the double doors, functioning as an airlock, an antechamber between the outside world and your freezer. Every time a settler enters or leaves carrying food, this double door prevents heat exchange with the outside environment, keeping the internal temperature stable even at the peak of summer. It's simple, it's elegant, and it works without needing any advanced technology. And you know what the most satisfying part of all this is? You reach your second summer with the colony well established, other players are running after ice and watching their food spoil, and your underground pantry is perfectly calm, stocked, and cold. No ice, no magic, just good construction and knowledge of mechanics. This is exactly the kind of thing that separates those who survive the early game from those who truly master Going Medieval 1.0. If you don't have your underground cell built yet, go do it now, because in the summer, you'll be thankful. There is a mechanic that can erase hours of work in a matter of seconds, and the game barely warns you when you are about to cross that line. I'm talking about the structural stability system, which calculates in real time if every wall, roof, and column has enough support to stay standing. Most people discover this the worst possible way, happily mining a massive underground hall and watching everything collapse in a devastating chain reaction. The general rule you need to memorize is any underground room larger than approximately 7 by 7 blocks without central support will collapse. And what makes this so treacherous is the domino effect. When one block loses stability and falls, it pulls its neighbor, which pulls the next, and in a few seconds, you're looking at a giant hole where your pantry, workshop, or dormitory used to be. It's not a graceful collapse, it's a total destruction that takes everything inside with it, including items, furniture, and any settler in the area. The solution is simple, but it requires construction discipline right from the start. Wooden beams every 3 blocks, or strategically placed central columns, are enough to hold up massive roofs and give you total freedom to excavate large halls. Think of these columns as the pillars of a medieval cathedral. They don't get in the way of the space. On the contrary, they are what allows the space to exist safely. If you are mining anything larger than 6 by 6, place a support before continuing to excavate, not after. What makes this mechanic so cruel is that it is completely invisible until it happens. There is no flashing integrity bar, no red alert screaming that the roof is going to cave in. The game simply calculates, decides that the physics don't add up anymore, and destroys everything. It's one of the most honest and brutal mechanics a colony simulator can have, because it forces you to think like a real medieval engineer. And when you learn to respect the structure, Going Medieval 1.0 opens up in a completely different way. If you chose a swamp map thinking it would be a different adventure, congratulations, you've made the most stressful decision in the game without knowing it. Basement flooding is now an official event in 1.0, which means that in spring or on humid maps, water can invade your underground and turn that beautiful subterranean base you spend hours building into a completely useless medieval pool. And the worst part is that most players aren't prepared for it when it happens the first time. The good news is that the game gives you specific tools to deal with this, and the main one is mesh floors. Unlike a normal wood or stone floor, the mesh floor allows water to drain quickly downwards instead of accumulating on the surface. It's a simple solution, but it needs to be planned before the problem appears, not during the flood with your settlers splashing in the mud while your food supply rots. Besides the mesh floor, you have two more strategies that work very well depending on the situation. Expanding the flooded room creates more volume for the water to dissipate naturally over time, especially useful when the flooding isn't as severe. Destroying smaller walls or strategically filling them in, on the other hand, can redirect the flow and speed up evaporation. The logic here is basically rudimentary water engineering. You are controlling where the water goes, not trying to ignore that it exists. What makes this mechanic so interesting is that it adds a layer of urban planning that few colony simulators have the courage to implement. You can't just dig wherever you want and ignore the map's geography. In Going Medieval 1.0, the terrain reacts, the water flows, and your base needs to be prepared for this right from the foundation. When you master drainage and reach spring without getting a drop of water in your basement, it gives a feeling of competence that no other simulator delivers quite the same way. This is one of those mechanics that seems small at first, but once you understand it, the colony's rhythm simply changes. Many people focus on building more, planting more, producing more, when in fact, the real bottleneck is item transport. And that's where the absurd value of taming pack animals early comes in, because the moment you get a deer, horse, donkey, or even a goat to help with hauling, your settlers stop wasting time on manual labor and start doing what really matters. The most interesting detail is that this doesn't just work any way you do it. You need a settler with a high animal handling skill to speed up this process. When this settler tames the animals early on, you turn common beasts into true logistical assistants for the base. I like this mechanic because it has that charm of a practical secret, almost as if the game is rewarding you for thinking beyond the obvious and realizing that efficiency doesn't just come from more workers, but from a better distribution of labor. And the funniest thing is that a lot of people tame the animal and stop there without realizing that the catch is turning on the hauling function in the domesticated animals menu. That's the moment they stop being just part of the scenery or a resource reserve and become real pieces of the colony's economy. Suddenly, wood, food, stone, and materials start circulating with much less human effort, and that feeling of overloaded settlers largely disappears. In practice, it almost feels like you gained extra workforce without having to wait for new survivors to arrive. For me, this is one of the best hidden mechanics in the game, because it isn't flashy, but the impact is massive. There are no explosions, no big events, no impressive visual effects, but your entire base just starts working better. And in a colony simulator, that is worth its weight in gold. When you learn to tame early and use these animals as haulers, Going Medieval 1.0 becomes less about constantly putting out fires and more about truly commanding a colony that finally feels organized. There's a resource that almost always gets discarded without a second thought, and that is an expensive mistake down the line. Bones. Seem like garbage at first, that annoying byproduct left over after slaughtering animals that ends up in a forgotten pile in the corner of the map. But when you understand what you can do with them, you start looking at every deer and every dead animal as a resource that goes far beyond meat. The most powerful application is turning bones into deer heads using the decoration table. And here's the part most ignore. These pieces significantly increase a room's impressiveness. In Going Medieval 1.0, impressiveness directly impacts the mood and productivity of settlers inside that space. So a dining room or a bedroom decorated with these pieces isn't just aesthetics, it's a real functional upgrade for your colony. Or, if you prefer, they're great to sell to merchants and bring in resources you don't yet have access to produce. But there is an even more specific trick that circulates among more experienced players. If you place 4 deer heads on a wooden wall and then destroy that wall, the bones simply vanish from the system. It serves as a clean disposal method when you have excess and don't want them piling up in storage. It's the type of interaction between mechanics that the game doesn't explain anywhere. You only discover it by testing or hearing from someone who has. What I find most fascinating about this mechanic is that it teaches you not to waste anything, which is exactly the philosophy a medieval colony simulator should have. You're building a community from scratch with limited resources, and every thrown-away bone is a missed opportunity to decorate better, sell more, or manage space more intelligently. Going Medieval 1.0 is full of layers like this, small mechanics that seem irrelevant, but when fitted into the right strategy, make all the difference between a surviving colony and a truly thriving one. This is one of the simplest tricks, but it saves entire playthroughs when you discover it at the right time. This situation is classic. You're in the middle of a heavy winter, the settler's exhaustion bar is almost at the red limit, and yet they keep carrying stone, cooking, or doing any other task instead of simply going to sleep. The AI sometimes gets stuck in this work logic and doesn't reevaluate priorities on its own. And that's when you start seeing settlers passing out from exhaustion in the middle of the workshop. The trick is ridiculously straightforward. Select the problematic settler, activate the draft command with the R key, and immediately remove the draft right after. This quick cycle forces the artificial intelligence to stop whatever it was doing and reevaluate from scratch what the most urgent action is at that moment. Since exhaustion is high, the system recognizes sleep as the top priority, and the settler heads straight to bed without detours. It's almost like manually rebooting the AI's decision-making process. What makes this trick so valuable is that it works in various situations beyond sleep. Whenever a settler seems to be stuck in a strange behavior loop, performing an unnecessary task while ignoring something urgent, the draft and undraft cycle serves as a general reset. It's one of those solutions the community discovered by testing the limits of the system, not something the game teaches you. And when you internalize this, that frustration of seeing settlers destroying themselves over bad AI decisions simply ceases to exist. To me, this trick says a lot about how Going Medieval 1.0 works at its core. The game gives you real control tools, but hides a good part of them in mechanics that seem to have another purpose. The draft officially exists for combat and direct control of settlers, but in practice, it has become a behavior management tool that no tutorial mentions. It's the kind of knowledge that separates those who play Going Medieval from those who really understand Going Medieval. And now you're in that second group. There's one thing enemies do in an absolutely predictable way. And when you realize it, your colony's defense changes completely. They always take the shortest path to the objective. No exceptions, no surprises, no creative flanking. And when you understand that the pathfinding system works like this, you realize you aren't just building a wall to absorb damage, you are building a trap where you control exactly where the enemy will pass and what will happen to them when they do. The strategy born from this is simple and devastating at the same time. A wall around the entire base with a single entrance, just one. No alternative gates, no gaps, no secondary paths. When the attack begins, all enemies converge on that exact point because the algorithm leaves them no choice. And that is exactly where you position your archers on elevated platforms with a direct line of sight to the entrance. The result is a kill corridor where you control the pace of combat while your settlers shoot from above with practically no real risk. What elevates this strategy from good to exceptional is the height factor. Archers positioned in towers or platforms above ground level get accuracy and range bonuses, and enemies trying to enter through the door are exposed for longer while trying to advance. You can add traps in the entrance corridor, double doors to hold up the flow, or even a moat around the wall to funnel the path even more. Every layer you add multiplies the defense's efficiency without needing more settlers, just better positioning. What fascinates me about this mechanic is that it is simultaneously a critique and a complement to the game's design. Predictable pathfinding might seem like a limitation, but in practice, it has become a strategic tool in the hands of those who know how to use it. Going Medieval 1.0 is telling you that smart defense beats brute force every time, and that you don't need an army of armed settlers to survive the hardest attacks. You need well-thought-out architecture, patience to build it the right way, and the knowledge that the enemies will go exactly where you want them to go. Going Medieval 1.0 is full of hidden survival and strategy mechanics, but this one is different because it's about something many people don't even consider important at first: the appearance of your colony. There is a UI detail that almost no one discovers on their own, which is double-clicking a wall. When you do this, the game automatically selects all walls of the same type around it, turning a task that would take minutes of individual clicking into an instantaneous action. It's the kind of shortcut that seems obvious once you know it, but can go unnoticed for hundreds of hours. The truly fascinating part is that behind this mass selection lies a visual customization system that the game hides well. You can change the style of your wooden structures to have rounded edges, different corners, variations that completely transform the building's look. A cabin that once looked like a generic square box can become a rustic log cabin with that organic, handcrafted wood aesthetic. And the visual impact is genuinely beautiful. It isn't just meaningless cosmetics. It's the difference between a base that looks functional and a base that looks lived in by real people. What makes this mechanic so special is that it exists in a game where most people are focused on surviving and rarely stop to think about aesthetics. And precisely because of that, when you start exploring the available building styles, it feels like you're uncovering a layer of the game that was made with care, but that few actually get to see. Changing the material in the building menu before erecting it, or selecting everything at once with a double click and changing the style later, opens up a creative freedom that transforms Going Medieval from a survival simulator into something much closer to a world builder. For me, this mechanic represents the best a colony simulator can offer: the ability to make your base tell a story visually. It's not just where your settlers sleep and work, it's a place you built with intention, with style, with identity. And when you combine this with everything else the game offers, the temperature system, the structure, the defense, Going Medieval 1.0 stops being just about surviving and starts being about creating something that is genuinely yours. That double click might seem small, but it opens a huge door for those who want to go beyond the basics. There's a situation in Going Medieval 1.0 that seems completely innocent until you realize the damage it's causing. Your kitchen and your food cellar are side by side, separated by a single door, and every time a settler goes in to cook or grab ingredients, the heat from the kitchen invades the cellar and starts compromising your stockpile's temperature. It's silent, it's gradual, and when you notice your food is rotting in the summer, despite having a well-built underground cellar, the cause is almost never obvious at first glance. The solution is to build an antechamber between the two areas, basically an airlock at least 3 blocks long with 2 separate doors. The logic is simple. When a settler enters through the first door, it closes before the second one opens, and this intermediate space acts as a thermal buffer that prevents direct heat exchange between the two environments. It's exactly the same principle that industrial cold rooms use in real life, and Going Medieval 1.0 implements this in a way that mechanically works within the game's temperature system. The detail that maximizes the effect is the cellar wall's material. Clay has an insulation of approximately 0.9, which is one of the highest values available in the game for basic construction. And when you combine clay walls with the antechamber, you are creating a double barrier against outside heat. The antechamber handles the temperature flow during settler movement, and the clay walls hold back any residual variation that still tries to penetrate. Together, these two elements turn the cellar into a truly stable environment across all seasons. What impresses me about this mechanic is that it requires you to think about the flow of people inside your base, not just the static construction. It's not enough to have a well-insulated cellar if you don't control how heat enters and exits it through the constant movement of settlers. Going Medieval 1.0 is asking you to think like a real medieval architect, considering not only the walls, but the behavior of those who will use that space. And when you apply this correctly, the food stops rotting, the settlers stop complaining, and that feeling of finally having tamed the game's temperature system is genuinely satisfying. If you are still placing archers on the ground to defend your colony, you are wasting the biggest trump card they have. Height changes everything in the game's combat system, and when you combine a well-built tower with merlons on top, a single archer becomes a defense force worth far more than any group of fighters on the front line. It's one of those mechanics that seems obvious in retrospect, but requires you to understand how the game calculates range, accuracy, and cover before it makes total sense. Merlons, those classic medieval castle battlements, are not just decoration in Going Medieval 1.0. They function as real cover for archers positioned at the top of the tower, significantly reducing the damage taken from enemy projectiles while your settlers continue firing freely. In practice, this means your archer can spend an entire battle at an elevated vantage point, dealing constant damage and absorbing almost none in return. The combat asymmetry this creates is brutal for attackers and comfortable for you. What turns the strategy from good to insane is combining both factors at the same time, height and cover. Height increases shooting range and accuracy, allowing your archers to start hitting enemies long before any threat gets close to the walls. Merlons ensure they survive long enough to empty out entire groups of attackers before any melee combat even begins. Combine this with the enemy's predictable pathfinding mechanics, and you have a defensive system that can stop attacks much larger than your number of settlers suggests is possible. For me, this mechanic is the point where Going Medieval finally makes you feel like you are building a real castle and not just a functional base. There is something very satisfying about watching a single archer high in a tower hold off an entire horde, while the other settlers continue working normally down below, completely oblivious to the chaos. The game is rewarding you for thinking vertically, for investing in structure before investing in warriors, and for understanding that in medieval defense, position is worth more than numbers.